So on my blog, I have a public-facing portion, which you all see, and a private-facing portion, which I use to author and publish my articles. And these are today two completely separate ColdFusion applications. And for a brief period, I considered combining the two and then just dynamically changing the session management such that the public-facing code for y'all didn't have session management, but when I was accessing it, it would have session management and I could log in and do all the publishing. And I decided not to do that, but I thought it would make an interesting demo just to showcase how incredibly flexible the ColdFusion application framework is. So here I have a single ColdFusion application, and you can see that sessions are currently disabled. And if I refresh, nothing interesting is happening. I have a little cache busting URL here just to showcase that something's changing. And now I can start session management in this one ColdFusion application, and I'm going to keep track of the hit count. And now you can see I can refresh, and every time I refresh, the hit count goes up. We're at 5 now. So now I can stop session management for, again, this ColdFusion application. Let's hit refresh a bunch of times, and you can see the URL changing. And now let's start session management again. Now we were at hit count 5 before, so we should go to 6 when I re-enable it, or 7, maybe I miscounted. So we're at 7, and now if I refresh, you can see we're going up. And again, I can stop it. Let's refresh a bunch of times just to showcase that the hit counter is not being affected, because now again, if I hit start, we're going to be back to where we were before, and now you can see it's happening again. Now, this is being dictated by a cookie. So if we open up our edit cookie application, you can see I have my CFID and CF token cookies for the session bindings, but then I have this enable session cookie. And what you'll see is that if I delete this cookie and I refresh the page, my session management is gone. And again, we can refresh here, we can look here, cookie still gone. Now if I start the session, you'll see we pick up where we left off. And if we look at the cookies this time, this enable session cookie is back. So what we're doing is using this cookie as a flag to indicate whether or not we want the current request associated with session management. And this is just an arbitrary cookie. This has nothing to do with ColdFusion specifically. It's just what we're using in our particular context. So let's see how this works. If we jump over into our Application.cfc ColdFusion component, this is our ColdFusion framework component. What we have in this area of the code is called our pseudo constructor. The pseudo constructor is the code that is inside of the CF component tags, but outside of any of the functions. And the pseudo constructor gets called or executed every time a ColdFusion component is instantiated. Now here's something that may not be obvious to people who are relatively new to ColdFusion. The Application.cfc ColdFusion component is instantiated on every single request that comes into your ColdFusion application. It is not a cached instance. It doesn't get run once and then cached in memory. It's instantiated on every single request, which means this pseudo constructor gets run on every single request. Now, part of the role of the ColdFusion application component is to bind, so to speak, the incoming request to the ColdFusion memory space. Your application scope, your session scope, these things exist outside of the request context. So part of the job of the Application.cfc is to take that incoming request and bind it to the existing application scope, to the existing page context, to the existing session scope, if it can be associated. And it does that with our settings here in the pseudo constructor and then the cookies associated with the incoming request. So what we're doing here in our pseudo constructor is we're looking to see if that enable session cookie exists. Again, that's this cookie right here. If that cookie exists, we're going to turn session management on and have it set the client cookies and the timeout. These are the traditional session management related settings. If the enable session cookie does not exist, we're going to set session management to false. Now, if we set session management to false, that doesn't mean our session has ended. It doesn't mean that we're killing the session behind the scenes. The session continues to exist regardless of whether or not we use it. The session management basically only says, okay, for the incoming request, try to associate this request with the existing session scope based on these CFID and CF token cookies in this particular case. That's the default behavior of the ColdFusion framework. So in our case, if we do have sessions, we're going to call the onSession start the first time that session is instantiated. We're going to hit the request count. We're going to set the request count to 0. And then in the onRequest start, you can see we're incrementing that request count by 1 each time. Now, if session management is not enabled, the session scope doesn't actually exist, which means that if you try to reference it, you'll get a null reference error, or basically saying that session is undefined. So to make that easier to consume, in our onRequest start here, I'm going to check to see if the session scope is defined at all. Note, you cannot check this with is null. You have to use is defined. And if it's defined, I'm going to say sessions enabled on the request scope. And then we can look at our index page and we can see that, for example, I'm looking in the request is session scope enabled here before I try to refer to the session scope. And that's where we're outputting our hit count. So once we understand how the request is associated with the behind the scenes application scopes and session scopes using the pseudo constructor, using the incoming cookies, we can now see that our demo page, our index page, is doing little more than either setting or defining that cookie or deleting that cookie if we tell it to with our URL parameters. And that's what we're doing here with the stop. You can't see it because it's refreshing itself, but it was sending across a URL. We can actually open this up here so you can see that this is happening. If we do stop, you can see here it is sending across that stop session equals true, and then it's refreshing. And then if we do start, you can see it's sending across the start session equals true. And if we look here, what we'll see actually is the set cookie response header somewhere down here. Did I miss it? Oh, this is request. Response here, set cookie, enable session is true, and then it refreshes, and now that's what associates the incoming request with the session behind the scenes. And you can see even after all my yammering here, we're just picking up where we left off in terms of the hit count, and we can keep refreshing and then or stopping. So again, I decided not to do this. It adds obviously some complexity here. I think that is clear, but it does make fertile ground, I think, for showcasing just how flexible the ColdFusion application framework is. The fact that our application gets instantiated on every single request gives us a lot of control on a per request basis how the application is going to behave. Now, this is not always a quote unquote good thing. We want a lot of our stuff to be static, like the name of the application. You pretty much want that to be consistent, or bad things happen because you can't associate with the proper application scope. Things like data source configurations, SMTP servers, all that stuff should probably be static. You don't want to muck with it. But something like session management, we're starting to see places where we have a little bit more wiggle room, a little bit more opportunity to get jiggy with it, to get creative with it. Now, you might just be asking yourself, why not just leave session management enabled all the time? Why even bother considering something like this? And the answer is memory. When you allocate a session, that session has to be stored somewhere, right? Even if we're not using the session, like we're not using the session right now, that session is persisted in memory, which is why when we start the session again, we're not actually quote unquote starting a session. We're associating the request with the already instantiated session behind the scenes. And that instantiated session has to be stored somewhere. And it's based on cookies. So imagine something like a search engine crawler that's hitting your site tens of thousands of times a day, or hundreds of thousands of times a day. If you can imagine that it's not sending cookies with those requests, which means that every single request that comes in, if you have session management enabled, is starting up a new session and storing it in memory. So that can very quickly eat up your server's memory space, or whichever storage engine you've chosen to store your sessions. Now, is that a problem in today's modern architectures where storage is wicked cheap? Maybe not. Maybe it is. It depends on the volume and the amount of memory you have. But if nothing else, it's worth considering the pros and cons of having sessions enabled for your application. And again, this I thought was just a fun context in which to explore the highly, highly dynamic nature of our ColdFusion application framework. I think ColdFusion is far more dynamic than a lot of people even realize. And hopefully this just sheds a little light on that for you and your ColdFusion applications going forward.